Snow piles against bark walls. Wind cuts through bare trees. Inside, firelight flickers across dozens of faces. Families sleep shoulder to shoulder on raised platforms while smoke drifts toward the ceiling. Outside, the temperature plunges below freezing. Inside, children sleep warm. This is a Haudenosaunee longhouse in the dead of winter, a structure that stretches over 200 feet and houses more than 20 families under a single curved roof. For 6 months each year, from mid-October through mid-May, these communities remained sealed inside against brutal cold, deep snow, and relentless wind. Survival depended entirely on architecture. The question isn't whether they built a shelter. The question is how they engineered a wooden structure using only saplings, bark, and rope to generate enough warmth for dozens of people, store 6 months of food and firewood, manage toxic smoke from multiple fires, and maintain breathable air, all without metal fasteners, mortar, or modern insulation. The Haudenosaunee referred to themselves as the people of the Longhouse. The name wasn't metaphorical. The building defined everything: their social structure, their political confederation, their survival through winter. To understand how they lived, you must first know how they built. The Longhouse began with a problem of materials. The virgin forests of the northeastern woodlands grew massive trunks, oaks, and chestnuts, with diameters too wide for stone axes to fell efficiently, too heavy for work crews to haul and position. Attempting to construct with these giants would have consumed months of labor for a single structure. The Haudenosaunee solved this by targeting second-growth forests. These were clearings where older trees had died or been removed, allowing younger growth to surge upward in competition for sunlight. The result was dense stands of straight, slender saplings, cedar, hickory, and elm, sized for human handling. Trees between 4 and 8 inches in diameter could be felled, stripped, and shaped in hours rather than weeks. Material selection extended beyond convenience. The framework required 2 types of wood with opposing properties. Vertical posts needed stiffness to bear the roof load without buckling. Rafters needed flexibility to bend into the characteristic barrel vault without snapping. Young saplings provided both. Thicker specimens became posts. Thinner, greener saplings bent into arches. Construction timing wasn't arbitrary. Building happened in late spring and early summer when sap flowed heavily through the cambium layer beneath the bark. This narrow seasonal window served 2 purposes. First, the moisture made young saplings pliable enough to bend into smooth curves without fracturing the wood fibers. Second, and more critically, the sap flow allowed builders to harvest bark in massive sheets without prematurely killing the donor tree. Elm bark was preferred. A mature elm could yield panels measuring 3 feet high and 6 feet long, large enough to cover substantial sections of framework with minimal seams. The harvesting technique required precision. Builders made vertical cuts down the trunk, then horizontal cuts at the top and bottom. During peak sap flow, the bark layer separated cleanly from the sapwood beneath, peeling away in flexible sheets that could be rolled for transport. The framework rose in stages. Vertical posts were planted in pairs along 2 parallel lines, spaced 20 feet apart. This width became standard, narrow enough to span with available rafters, wide enough to accommodate a 10-foot central aisle with 5-foot living platforms along each wall. Post pairs were positioned every 20 feet down the length, creating modular compartments that could extend the structure to 30, 60, 100, or even 200 feet, depending on the size of the extended family group. Crossbeams connected the post tops, forming a rectangular frame. Then came the critical innovation. Young, flexible saplings were bent from one side to the other, creating the rounded roof profile. This barrel vault shape wasn't decorative, it was thermal engineering. The entire frame was held together by lashing, long strips of bark, typically basswood or hickory, braided into rope. No nails, no wooden pegs, no notched joints. Every connection consisted of carefully wrapped and knotted bark cordage. This choice seems primitive until you consider the environmental forces. Winter brought extreme temperature swings. Wood contracts in cold, expands in warmth. Frozen ground heaves upward with ice lenses, then settles in the spring thaw. Wind loads shift constantly. Rigid connections, pegs driven into drilled holes, notched timbers locked at right angles, crack under this repeated stress. They fail catastrophically. Lashed joints flex. When wind pushes against the structure, the bark rope absorbs the force through slight movement. When frost heaves the ground, the frame adjusts rather than shatters. The entire building breathes with environmental stress rather than resisting it. This dynamic stability, not static strength, kept longhouses standing through decades of seasonal extremes. Two lashing techniques dominated. Square lashing secured perpendicular joints, vertical posts to horizontal crossbeams. The rope was wrapped in a specific pattern, around one pole, then around the other, pulling them together at a 90-degree angle with each pass. Diagonal lashing joined poles meeting at different angles, particularly the cross braces that prevented the frame from racking sideways under wind load. Each technique required knowledge of tension, friction, and binding geometry, which was passed from builder to builder. With the skeleton complete, cladding began. Bark panels were lashed to the outside of the framework in horizontal courses, overlapping like shingles. Orientation mattered. Tree bark grows with vertical furrows, natural channels that would funnel rainwater directly down the wall if positioned vertically. By lashing the bark horizontally, these furrows ran parallel to the ground. Water hit the outer surface and sheeted sideways off the building rather than penetrating seams. Some builders went further. Using a stone adze, a cutting tool with the blade perpendicular to the handle, they smoothed the horizontal furrows on each bark panel before installation, creating an even flatter surface that shed water more efficiently. The final weatherproofing step involved a second layer of poles lashed to the exterior, directly over the bark cladding. This outer lattice pressed the bark sheets flat against the inner framework, preventing wind from catching edges and peeling the weather barrier away. The result was a triple-layer shell, an inner frame, bark insulation, and an outer compression lattice. With the walls sealed, the structure faced its central paradox. Fire generates heat. Heat sustains life. Fire also produces smoke. Smoke kills. A longhouse 200 feet long housed 20 to 30 families, 60 to 100 people. Cooking, warmth, and light all depended on open flames. A single central fire couldn't heat the entire length. The solution was distributed hearths, one fire pit in the center aisle of each 20-foot compartment. A 200-foot longhouse might contain 10 separate fires burning simultaneously. 10 fires produce massive volumes of smoke. Without ventilation, the interior would become uninhabitable within minutes, a toxic chamber of carbon monoxide and particulate matter. But ventilation means opening holes in the roof. Holes release heat. Heat is the entire purpose of the structure. The Haudenosaunee engineered a solution that balanced these opposing needs. Above each hearth, a smoke hole was cut through the roof. The hole wasn't left open. A bark panel covered it, attached in such a way that it could be adjusted, propped open wide, closed nearly shut, or angled to account for wind direction. This adjustability was critical. On calm days, the flap could open fully, allowing smoke to pour out while minimizing heat loss. During high winds or driving snow, the flap closed tighter, restricting airflow to prevent downdrafts from blowing smoke back into the living space and to minimize the escape of precious warm air. The person tending each fire managed their corresponding smoke hole, constantly adjusting based on draft conditions, fire intensity, and outdoor weather. But ventilation alone didn't solve the smoke problem. The smoke had to go somewhere before it reached the vent. The Longhouse turned this constraint into an advantage through vertical organization. The barrel-vaulted roof created a tall interior space, 20 feet from floor to peak. The living area occupied only the lower 12 feet. Above that stretched an 8-foot void. Smoke from the hearths rose naturally, accumulating in this upper zone before gradually working its way toward the exit holes. This high-altitude smoke layer formed a blanket that trapped warm air below while insulating the living space from the cold roof. The smoke blanket wasn't just tolerated, it was designed into the system, and it served a second critical function in winter survival: food preservation. Survival through a 6-month winter required storing massive quantities of harvested crops. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters of Haudenosaunee agriculture, had to be dried, processed, and stored to prevent spoilage until the spring planting season. Dried corn was braided into long strands. Beans were stored in bark containers. All of it hung from the rafters in the smoke zone. Smoke cures food. The chemical compounds in wood smoke inhibit bacterial growth and repel insects. By storing provisions in the constant smoke stream, the Haudenosaunee transformed their ventilation problem into a preservation system. The same smoke that made the interior hazy kept their food supply from rotting. Ethnographic accounts confirm the interior was very smoky. This wasn't a design failure, it was a trade-off they were willing to accept. Constant smoke irritation was the price of warmth and preserved food. Long-term respiratory health was sacrificed for immediate survival. The brutality of the winter cold left no other option. Heat generation relied on more than fire. The Longhouse was engineered to extract thermal energy from every available source, including the occupants themselves. 20 to 30 families sleeping in close proximity, 60 to 100 human bodies generate significant heat. A resting adult produces roughly 100 watts of thermal energy, equivalent to a bright incandescent bulb. 100 people make 10,000 watts, equivalent to the output of a small space heater. During the coldest months, families deliberately maximized this effect by sleeping huddled together around the hearth pits. Body heat became a constant, passive supplement to the fire. The rounded roof shape amplified heat retention through convection. Warm air rises. In a peaked roof, rising air accumulates at the apex and stagnates, creating a hot zone far above the living space. The barrel vault changed this. As air warmed near the fires and rose toward the curved ceiling, it followed the curve back down toward the outer walls, creating a circulation loop. Heat didn't escape to a dead zone. It cycled continuously through the occupied space. The bark cladding itself provided minimal insulation compared to thick earthen walls or stone. The survival strategy didn't rely on preventing heat loss. It relied on generating heat faster than it could escape and controlling the rate of loss through managed ventilation. The system operated on continuous input rather than stored thermal mass. The floor plan reflected this thermal logic. The central 10-foot aisle served as the fire management zone and the primary circulation path. Along each wall, raised platforms extended 5 feet inward, 1 foot above the packed earth floor. This elevation was essential. Cold air sinks. The floor was the coldest part of the interior. Sleeping directly on the ground would have drained body heat through conduction into the frozen earth. The 1-foot gap created an insulating air layer. Fur bedding on the platforms added further separation from the cold. The platforms served triple duty. During the day, they functioned as benches for sitting and working. At night, they became elevated beds, and the space beneath them was dedicated to firewood storage. Keeping wood under the sleeping surface kept it dry and accessible. The ambient heat from nearby fires slowly dried any moisture from the logs, ensuring they burned efficiently when needed. Above the sleeping platforms, a shelf ran the length of each wall. This was personal storage, including clothing, tools, and small goods. But the primary storage zone was vertical. The rafters spanning the upper third of the structure were festooned with hanging provisions. Corn braids, bean sacks, dried fish, medicinal herbs, everything needed to sustain the community until spring. This vertical storage strategy maximized the use of the high ceiling volume while keeping food out of reach of domestic animals and children. The architecture was fundamentally a storage container. The living space was built around the thermal and preservation infrastructure, not the other way around. The extraordinary length and height of the longhouse were driven by the need to house 6 months of resources for dozens of people, not by the desire for spacious accommodation. Organization extended to social structure. Each 20-foot compartment housed 2 families, both of which traced their lineage through the female line. The matrilineal kinship system meant that when a man married, he moved into his wife's longhouse. Children belonged to their mother's clan. Authority over the longhouse resided with the clan mother, the senior woman of the extended family. The clan mother managed domestic affairs, including food distribution, task assignment, and maintaining social order within the structure. She also held political power. When the men of the longhouse went to council, they represented their clan. However, the clan mother selected the men who would serve as representatives. Political authority began inside the longhouse walls. This social organization wasn't incidental to the architecture. The structure enabled it. Housing an extended matrilineal family required space for multiple generations under one roof. The modular 20-foot compartments allowed the longhouse to grow as the family grew. When a daughter married, her compartment expanded, or a new section was added to the existing building. The architecture was elastic, adapting to demographic changes. The longhouse also housed clan identity. Each Haudenosaunee clan was identified by an animal or bird totem: turtle, bear, wolf, hawk. The clan's symbol was often displayed on the exterior of the longhouse, marking it as the domain of that particular kinship group. Inside, all residents shared the same clan identity. If you were a Bear Clan member, every longhouse resident was considered family. This structure of kinship, authority, and architecture formed the foundation of the Haudenosaunee political system. The confederacy that united the 5 original nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, was conceptualized as a single massive longhouse stretching across the territory. The Mohawk lived in the east. They became the keepers of the eastern door. The Seneca lived in the west. They became the keepers of the western door. These nations guarded the territorial boundaries of the Confederacy, just as the end walls of a physical longhouse guarded the interior from the elements. The Onondaga occupied the central territory. They became the keepers of the Central Council fire and wampum, the symbolic hearth around which the nations gathered for deliberation. Their geographic position mirrored the location of the central fire in a domestic longhouse, the place where decisions were made and warmth was shared. But this wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was a form of political architecture translated from the domestic scale to the territorial scale. The success of the communal survival system, in which multiple families shared fire and space, managed resources collectively, and organized around matrilineal authority, provided a template for organizing various nations. The building form became the governmental form. The Great Law of Peace, the founding document of the Confederacy, structured decision-making around this Longhouse framework. The Mohawk, Seneca, and Onondaga were designated elder brothers. The Cayuga and Oneida were younger brothers. Decisions required consensus between the two groups, mirroring the balance between the two sides of a physical longhouse, where families on opposite walls shared a central fire. Scholars suggest this participatory governance structure influenced later democratic systems, including elements of the American Constitution. Whether or not that direct influence occurred, the principle remains. The Haudenosaunee built a political system that reflected their lived experience of communal architecture. The Longhouse taught them how to organize on a large scale. Construction was communal labor. Men felled the trees, shaped the posts, bent the rafters, and lashed the frame. Women prepared the bark panels and managed the interior organization. Children helped gather materials. The entire village participated. Building a 200-foot longhouse required coordinating dozens of workers, sourcing hundreds of saplings and bark sheets, and completing the work within the narrow spring construction window before the sap stopped flowing. This demanded planning, leadership, and synchronized effort, skills that translated directly to other collective endeavors like warfare, hunting, and diplomacy. Maintenance was continuous. Bark panels degraded under weather exposure. The outer surface, constantly battered by rain, snow, and sun, thinned and cracked over the years. When the roof bark became too worn to function, it was moved to the walls, where it faced less direct exposure. When the wall bark finally failed, it was replaced with fresh panels. Old wood was recycled. The bottoms of worn-out canoes, sections of broken tools, and any usable materials were incorporated into the repairs. This closed-loop material economy was essential. Villages couldn't relocate easily, as agriculture tied them to specific fields. But the local forest resources, including firewood and building materials, were depleted over time. Extending the life of every piece of wood delayed the eventual need to abandon the site and rebuild elsewhere. Archaeological evidence suggests villages relocated every few decades once firewood became scarce and soil fertility declined. The longhouse wasn't permanent in the sense that it was not built with stone architecture. It was semi-permanent, durable enough to last decades, but designed for eventual abandonment and reconstruction. The longhouse form wasn't unique to the Haudenosaunee. Similar structures appeared across cultures and eras wherever groups needed to house extended kin in challenging climates. Viking longhouses stretched across Scandinavia and Iceland. Like the Haudenosaunee version, these housed large family units around central hearths. But the materials differed. Viking longhouses used stone footings, log walls, and, in wood-scarce Iceland, turf roofs. The geometry was similar, long and narrow, communal, but the adaptation was specific to the available materials and local climate. Neolithic communal houses in Europe followed the same logic. Rice farming communities in Borneo built longhouses that stretched hundreds of feet, housing entire villages under one roof. The universal adoption of this form suggests it's an optimal response to sedentary communal living. Centralizing resources, sharing heat, and housing related groups under one roof solves fundamental survival problems regardless of geography. The genius of the Haudenosaunee system wasn't the rectangular form, but the material adaptation. Using bent saplings, bark cladding, and flexible lashing allowed for construction with minimal tools, such as axes and adzes, and maximum speed. The Norse required saws, augers, and skilled carpentry to shape heavy timbers. The Haudenosaunee could build with renewable forest materials harvested annually. This efficiency extended to thermal management. The smoke blanket system, which integrated ventilation with food preservation, was unique to the northeastern woodlands longhouses. The Vikings vented smoke through holes in the roof, but didn't incorporate it into a preservation strategy. The Haudenosaunee turned their smoke problem into a storage solution. The longhouse survived as more than architecture. It survived as an identity. When European colonization disrupted traditional settlement patterns, the physical structures disappeared from much of the territory, but the cultural significance remained. Today, communities like the Naws-Wawash Band of Indians continue to utilize structures known as longhouses as ceremonial and cultural centers. The Handsome Lake religion, a spiritual movement that emerged in the early 19th century, adopted the longhouse as its sacred meeting place. Contemporary Haudenosaunee identity remains tied to the concept even when the physical form has changed. The Confederacy still refers to itself as the Longhouse. The political structure established centuries ago continues to function. The Onondaga Nation still holds the wampum belts, the historical records of the Confederacy, and hosts the Grand Council. The metaphor persists because it worked. The architecture proved so successful as a model for organizing collective life that it outlasted the buildings themselves. What remains is a record of intelligence applied to the pursuit of survival. The Haudenosaunee faced 6 months of brutal cold with access to wood, bark, and stone tools. They engineered a structure that generated warmth, stored provisions, managed smoke, preserved food, and housed extended families. They built it using renewable materials harvested from managed forests. They organized labor collectively and maintained the buildings through continuous repair and recycling. The system worked because every element served multiple functions. Smoke vented and preserved. Platforms elevated and stored. Bark is insulated and weatherproofed. The architecture was efficient not through technological complexity, but through integrated design, where each component solved several problems simultaneously. The longhouse demonstrates that sophistication doesn't require advanced materials. It requires understanding the environment, exploiting available resources, and designing systems that balance competing needs. The Haudenosaunee built with wood and bark because that's what the forest provided. They mastered those materials so thoroughly that their structures lasted for decades and their cultural framework endured for centuries. Across the frozen months, families slept warm. Smoke drifted overhead. Corn hung in the rafters. Fire burned in the hearths. Outside, winter raged. Inside, life continued. The longhouse wasn't just a shelter. It was a tool for survival, a social blueprint, and a political philosophy. All built from bent saplings and sheets of bark lashed together with knowledge passed through generations. The people of the longhouse earned their name